Hi, welcome everybody to this book launch of Dan Bresnitz' book, Innovation in Real Places. My name is Ludwig Siegele. I write about technology for The Economist, and I'm going to have the honor to quiz Dan about his book here for an hour or so. Usually when I get asked to do book launches or even panels these days, I say no, I'm just too old for that. But when Dan asked me to do his book launch, to moderate his book launch, I didn't hesitate at all to say yes. And that's simply a question of giving back. Over the years, I think I know Dan now for 10 or 15 years. He probably knows better how long. He's been kind of very helpful in answering my very often ignorant questions. I've read his books, and so he's influenced my thinking quite a lot. So there was no reason to say no, and I said yes, and it's a great honor. But before we start talking about the book, I would like to ask you a somewhat personal question, Dan. So startups in Silicon Valley, what's very important is the creation myth. There must be, I think, a cottage industry of PR people coming up with stories, how startups are created, how the entrepreneur got to have the idea, what the itch is he or she wants to kind of solve the problem to solve. So Dan, tell me, what's your creation myth? What's the Bresnitz creation myth? How did you get into innovation policy? How did you get into thinking about it? I mean, it's a bit of an acquired taste, isn't it?
Yes, just like, single malts. But it takes time before you understand the smokiness. In my case, it's like everything in my life. It's a complete mistake. What you see behind you, in front of you, is somebody who always wanted to be a philosopher, political philosopher, theorist, and just got lost on the way. So what really happened is just before going to MIT, I started with three friends of mine, a company in Israel, a software company. And I say a software company because back in Israel, nobody heard about venture capital. Nobody heard about startups. So we still call those things software companies. We were very young, and indeed, people felt that something is changing. So we were allowed to take some projects, but they always commented that we are too young to really understand how to run a software company. I went to MIT. And then 3 years later, I came back basically to do some pilot study. And suddenly I came to a country completely transformed. Not only everybody and their aunt had a startup, but when I was talking to high schoolers, not only they knew what venture capital are, but they could actually discuss with me. And I came with a PhD from MIT, supposedly knowing what I'm talking about, the term sheet for venture capital. And I was like struck, what has happened? How this massive social science suddenly happened. I started to study the economic history of Israel, realized the role of a state policy in this. At the same time, I also started to be very interested in Ireland, Finland, and Taiwan. And that's end up as my first book, which I think you read. And innovation for me became a lens through which I look at social change, and especially social change for the good, if possible, and what we as a society, as a community, can actually do to improve our life, which is innovation. And so for me, it's a lens with which I can look at the technology, but I can also look at the technology, the social technology behind the technology that incentivize us to do certain kinds of technology and use certain kinds of business models when we do it. That's my creation story.
The interesting thing in your books or in your work is that it's very international. And I mean, that's probably why I found it very interesting for me, because I had to kind of travel around the world covering Israel or China or Taiwan, basically writing about the same things, not as well as you do, but it's very international. I wonder where that came from. And I mean, it's again very visible in your latest book. I mean, there are lots of case studies. I mean, the most important case studies, that's the stuff you need to know about innovation policy globally. Those cases are in there. So why this international perspective?
So first of all, because I'm a comparative political economist. So everything that I look about, it's not just this place, but it's the world. For innovation, it's even more important. I don't think you can understand. You have to really know a place to understand how it works, but you don't really understand it unless you know how other places work. So you have alternatives. That's one. The second, technology, and I hope we will have time to talk about it, and innovation has become a global game now. So if you don't understand both multiple of cases and how the global system of production work, you can talk a lot about technology and innovation, but you won't really understand.
Now, about your latest book. I mean, I gather from reading it that you don't like VCs, but I'm going to force you to do something, coming to treat me as a venture capitalist, and give me a 5-minute or 3 minutes elevator pitch of what the book is about.
Sure. So first of all, I have to say, with only a little bit of cynicism, that some of my best friends are venture capitalists. And if I was a startupist, I would love them. But for innovation and growth of communities, no, I don't like them. What's the book about? The book is really trying. I was struck by what I saw in Israel and in Silicon Valley, where you are, which is you have this massive growth and yet growing inequality at one time. And the other thing that we have discussed a lot about is that places all around the world understand that the only way to have sustained economic growth is innovation. And yet they spend billions of dollars basically on failed attempts. While we have a huge amount of research that explains how does that happen, how you can have innovation-based growth. My research, but also research of others, and yet no one has tried to say, okay, I'm not the president of the United States or an ideal type global ruler of the world. I am the mayor of Hamilton, Ontario, or Pittsburgh. How should I understand how to have innovation-based growth strategies, policies for my community in this very strange and very rough global system? And that's what the book is about. It's about why we should care about innovation, what is invention and why invention is not innovation, and how in a global system of production where we basically create now products in different stages in different places. Just look at your smartphone, for example. What does that mean for Pittsburgh, for Hamilton, for Toronto, for New York, for Hamburg? And that's what the book is about. It's great research, but also translating it to what does it mean for local leaders.
Now, let me push you on that a bit. I mean, you say that there's all these regions trying to be silicon hyphens, and kind of on one level, of course, it's true. But I remember, like, for 10 years, we make the joke at The Economist whenever some region wants to be a silicon hyphen. Oh yeah, we know this. But more seriously, yes, that I mean, regions try to sell themselves this way, and it's a lot of PR. But behind that, it seems to me that they're much more thoughtful about what they're doing. Or perhaps I'm too naive. I mean, it's quite well known that you can't kind of become the next Silicon Valley or even a kind of a second-tier Silicon Valley. It's really difficult. But perhaps you do have to do it for marketing purposes. But what's kind of the empirical evidence?
Unfortunately, you're doing a good job. So some regions might have understand that, but unfortunately, most regions have not read the news that you can't become Silicon Valley. And even if you're trying to be more sophisticated, what happens a lot of time, you go to regions, you ask them, okay, so what do you do for innovation? And they tell you, we have accelerators, we're trying to bring VCs, we're trying to create a great university, and we have a lot of entrepreneurship courses. What that really tells you is they might not think that they become the Silicon Valley, but they are trying to do exactly the same model of Silicon Valley. University-based startups fueled by VCs looking for financial exits, preferably on NASDAQ. And the other sad part is that, at least in Canada, you can now go to almost every big city in Canada and it will claim that it's trying, and seriously claim. You might laugh about it. I would actually cry about it, but they are quite serious that they think that they can become a mini Silicon Valley. Sorry, Ludwig, you need to do a better PR that this is a no option.
So if they can't be Silicon Valley, what should they do? I mean, I think at some point in the book you say the most important thing they need to do is have a vision. Now, I remember a German chancellor saying, if you want to have a vision, you need glasses. But what's the better choice than trying to be Silicon Valley?
Sure. So let's go back to the basic for a moment. Remember, we talk about invention and innovation and why we care about innovation. We care about, and so invention is coming up with a new idea. Okay, and that's great and it's important. Innovation is putting that idea to practice, if you talk about economic terms, in the market by coming up with new or better products, constantly improving them, products or services, figuring out how to produce them better. Let's talk about COVID, for example. I mean, it's great that we came up with vaccines, but as many countries, especially my poor country of Canada, now understand, the invention is great, but it's the innovation that really matters. You have to put this vaccine into production, massive amount of billions of units, and put it into people. And that's, if you will, is the innovation. Okay, and that's why we care about it. Which also tells the local leader, if you will, why should she care about innovation? She should care about innovation, not because it's cool, but because it promises good jobs and widespread prosperity for her community. Which is why, by the way, I don't like Silicon Valley and venture capital. Not because they're bad for innovation globally. They might be even good for innovation globally. But when you run that system for a local community, you end up like Silicon Valley and Tel Aviv. And that is an area where 10 to 15% of the people, which are the graduates of the best universities, get a lot of help, which, by the way, they shouldn't, because they're graduates of the best universities. They're probably well off in life. And they work on those software or high-tech or IT companies, basically doing just the R&D and then moving over production, which is where jobs happen and where real innovation happen around the world. And they get a lottery ticket, which is basically stock options for IPO. So what really happened, and if you think about Tel Aviv, because I know that you're in Silicon Valley, I don't want to just say bad thing about Silicon Valley. What you really should see in Tel Aviv in the last 20 to 30 years is 10 or 15% of the Israeli society now moved to wages that are as high as Silicon Valley. Wonderful life. They also have lottery tickets, which are called IPO. 85% of the population are stuck in stagnant, zero productivity sectors on the treadmill to nowhere. And there are now one out of every 5 households in Israel under the poverty line. That's the innovation, great economic miracle for most Israelis. And that's why I don't like Silicon Valley. Then you look, right, in innovation, how that idea translates to a real product. And what you see is that actually now stages all around the world. For example, semiconductor industry, which is an industry we both talked about for many years. Silicon Valley or Tel Aviv will put those new ideas of how to do it on silicon. This will move to Taiwan, which is now the best place on earth to produce, to actually take those ideas and make them into silicon. Then it will be shipped or redesigned and second production, second generation innovation, improvement, sometimes in Taiwan, sometimes else, move to final assembly into 10,000 of them needs to become one product in China. On the same way, Korea, for example, now focus on 2 or 3, like memory or screens that you need. All those places are extremely innovative. And as a matter of fact, just to show how innovative they are, the United States and Silicon Valley are now begging a Taiwanese company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, and I like that word, manufacturing corporation, begging it to open facilities in the US because the US have lost the plot how to innovate in the production of semiconductors in the US. What happens is in Taiwan, when you have those fabrication and second component, you have a huge amount of innovation. The high-end engineer might earn a little bit less, but you have jobs for a wider variety of people. And therefore, if I am the mayor of a city which is not in Silicon Valley, I would say, okay, why do I want innovation? I want it for my community. Should I focus on really the high end, or should I focus on innovational capacities in one of those other stages that, if I'm successful, create a lot wider prosperity for me and my people? And as I've seen from the case of TSMC, the case of Samsung, and the case of Huawei in 5th generation, does not mean that my companies actually don't have at least the same amount of power as supposedly the tech giants from Silicon Valley.
How do, as a city, as a locale, how do I get there? I mean, how do I kind of insert myself into this fragmented global supply chain kind of and specialize on one part? And also, is this actually plannable? Because many of the examples you write about in the book, Shenzhen, Taiwan, even Israel, I mean, you could look at them, yes, they're clever policy, but you could also interpret them as accidents, basically historical accidents. I mean, de Gaulle stopped selling weapons to Israel, and hence, I mean, that kind of kicked off the idea that they have to substitute with their own technology.
So, as a failed political theorist, I can tell you that Machiavelli used to quip that Fortuna loves those who are prepared for it. And the cases that you just mentioned did not happen by complete accident. The final product, yes, was not planned. And you ask even the policymakers who want to sell themselves, no, they didn't plan, but they did plan for innovation. And by that, I mean, they decided each one of those places very differently. So let me just use Taiwan and Israel just because you mentioned it. We can talk about Shenzhen later. In Israel, it was from day one, they said, look, there's no way we can do massive production in here. We don't have oil and any resources. So what we have is a mind, and their definition of what innovation is back then was science-based industries, because people like us did not invent high tech. And they created a model of how to incentivize individuals and companies. By the way, speaking of which, the only 2 agents of innovation in the economy, it's not universities, it's not, only 2 agents that actually do innovation in the economy are individuals and companies. So innovation policies need to change their behavior, not the behavior of other things, in order for them to come up with what we now call startups. Okay, so those are this kind of grants. The laws were changed after to create the VCs. A huge amount of effort was done to make sure that Israeli companies will actually go to NASDAQ, which is not, especially in the early 70s, not something that people heard about. Even when you devise a program with the United States of America, you agreed upon a division of labor where the product ideas come from the US, but R&D is done in Israel. You look at Taiwan, and what Taiwan says, we actually want production, but we know that we can't compete in the low end, right? And we don't want to. So what we need to do is to create highly innovative sub-suppliers for those big companies. And the way we do it is we infuse them with new technologies. Just think about your bikes, because I know you love to do mountain biking. There would be no modern mountain biking without a Taiwanese company called Giant. And there wouldn't be the success of Giant if it wasn't for a public research institution called ITRI that created and did the research on material science to allow Giants to create those kinds of frames. Okay, so the idea is to either infuse those companies, or in the case of semiconductor industry, where the private industry was not there, to create it. But the focus was on the production, not on we are going to invent the new things that you do with silicon, but we are going to focus on how to innovate in the production of silicon, so to speak. And then you create laws, you create change, how you treat people in universities, you create financial regulation, you create the same things which we call Silicon Valley, but look at Taiwanese VCs, Israeli VCs, and American VCs. There are two completely different entities that make money in a very different way.
So I mean, you're basically suggesting that these locales, they have to think hard about how they can come up with a set of institutions or incentives that kind of fit with their local constraints, but also with the constraints of the global supply chain.
Correct, but also, and I think that's where, so this is the advice I give, but there is another thing. You really need to think, and that's a vision. Let's assume we're successful with our innovation policies. How will my society, my community look? And is this what I want? And then do what we in engineering call reverse engineering. If this is the end, what I want, let's say most of my working population having good education, but not all of them can be R&D, but most of them have jobs that are both satisfying and can lead to what we call middle-class life. How my innovation policy leads there, not how my innovation policy leads to, you know, being claimed by The Economist or the New York Times. I'm the greatest startup hub in the world with inequality of, you know, stratospheric proportion.
And if you do that as a locale, I mean, you talk about a set of institutions, for example, research institutions. You mentioned ITRI or DARPA, and all of that, or let's say VCs. I mean, what's interesting in your book is that kind of they may be called the same in different places, but they look very differently. I mean, the example I think you also just mentioned is VCs in Taiwan. They're actually not VCs, even though they're called that. I mean, it's completely different setup. Or ITRI is not DARPA. So what is your advice there to see these regions, how to approach kind of these?
Sure. So if you remember, we talked about those stages, right? So the way that I think that an easy way to think about those stages is to think about them from the novelty, the Silicon Valley model, or the Silicon Valley stage, by the way. You can also do novelty, not just like Silicon Valley. Then there is a stage in which it's sort of the design and the second component. So I came up with a great idea for silicon. We talked about it, but I'm a designer in New York and I'm coming up with 5 fabulous luxury shoes for female that should cost 3,000 euros. How do I actually make that into shoes? And that's the places that make those into shoes, or to silicon, if you will. And then there's the, what we would like to call fast follower or incremental innovation, or constantly improving the old industries. So your home country of Germany is unbelievably good in doing that, and that's why people like me and your friends in Silicon Valley, until Tesla, which is, by the way, mostly German electric engineering by Bosch, if I remember correctly, wants a German car, even if it's supposedly from Silicon Valley. And then there's also the assembly and the actual production. When you look around you as a leader and you figure out in what industry and in what stage you can excel, and then when you build those institutions from education, from finance, from supposedly, by the way, science parks are completely different things in different parts of the world. And your financial regulation. Complement them so they would lead to the innovation capacities, which are very, very different, that excel in that stage. So ITRI, for example, is wonderful for Taiwan. Whether it would work something like that in Israel or in Canada, probably not. As a matter of fact, and we have discussed that the Israeli Innovation Authority was once called the Office of Chief Scientist, was created in order to manage basically public research institutions. The first chief scientist understood that this is a no-go for Israel and completely basically dunk that policy. So you need to understand what kind of institution would allow your agents of innovation, companies and individuals, to grow their companies, be innovative, and excel in that stage that you have decided, and be laser focused on that.
Great, Dan. So I want to open this up to questions from the audience. So you can do that by putting your question into the Q&A window, whatever you want to call it, here in Zoom. But before I take questions, I wanted to ask one last question here to Dan. Dan, I mean, in the book, you're actually not openly, but indirectly very critical of Silicon Valley. And I would like to know what you think about the future of Silicon Valley. I mean, has the valley peaked, or is that? I mean, you seem to be suggesting in the book that this type of innovation has its limits, and probably those limits will show more clearly in the future. But has it peaked?
So no, I have to say that I don't think that when I wake up in the middle of the night worrying about innovation in the world, Silicon Valley is not a place I'm worried about. As a matter of fact, in the book, I think that the fact that Silicon Valley has become so established as a startup hub, it basically sucks the talent and the small companies and the entrepreneurs, the best of the best from all around the world into it, which, by the way, is another reason why you can't have another Silicon Valley. Just think for a moment where Elon Musk was born, raised, and educated. And there's multiple. So the Silicon Valley is here to stay. Its model might change a bit, might not. The problem is not Silicon Valley. The problem is a massive inequality in Silicon Valley. And the problem is what to do with the other 97% of a country called the United States of America.
Okay, then let me take a question from the audience. Zach is asking is whether your thinking has changed or evolved, thinking about the role of networks in fostering innovation.
Sure. It's a very good question. So first of all, we haven't talked about one thing, and it's my remiss. So when you're thinking about in a global economy, about your locale and about that stage that we talked about and all those institutions, you also need to figure out how you institutionalize yourself in those global networks. So companies will actually, international companies and international finance will work with your locale. So first of all, that's my remiss. And I think that it's absolutely important, as one of the things that you do is to create what you call, hook your community, your network into the global buzz, but in an institutional way that move that buzz into the locale instead of sucking your people to Silicon Valley, which is too often the case. In terms of network, yes, they're absolutely important. They're absolutely important in all stages, but they work very differently. So if I am a startupist in Israel, or in Silicon Valley, I better become very quickly part of those networks, which will allow me to recruit people and recruit VCs, the one I don't like, and grow fast. But the same is also true if I'm in Brenta, Rivera de Brenta, and I want to reopen my own company that is tied to those global suppliers of high-end luxury shoes. What is interesting in those two networks, and what I think the Silicon Valley, and to a degree, but not really Tel Aviv, are unique, is that those networks are very close in Silicon Valley locally, but they're open, right? One of the things of why Silicon Valley is so successful, it allows people like Elon Musk and others to come to Silicon Valley and very quickly become part of this network. When you talk about the Rivera Lebentra or Taiwan or other, you have, or Finland, you have very, very close networks. But the problem there is that if you are not born and raised part of that network, you will almost not be able to become part of a local entrepreneurs. So one of the most interesting things to do is to see how different networks are needed, evolved, and the structure is needed to be sort of shepherded by public policy in different stages, different locales, so they can fit their industry.
A follow up to that. I mean, you talked about the pull of Silicon Valley, and because Silicon Valley is a more open platform, so to speak, or network, and so I wonder. I mean, yes, regions can try to avoid getting their kind of talent sucked into Silicon Valley or their startups, but isn't that really difficult given the pull of Silicon Valley and kind of the importance, let's say, of real platforms, software platforms, be it the Facebooks or the Googles. But I mean, we in any industry now, as you can see, kind of the concept of platform becoming the unit of analysis. I mean, isn't it kind of trying to tell windmills, trying to kind of escape the pull of Silicon Valley?
So first of all, yes, in the high-end, high-tech software and ICT, that's part of a reason why it was almost impossible. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of places that try to create Silicon Valley. And as I say, tell the story in the book of my old hometown, the city of Atlanta, ended up basically as a supplier cluster of really good talent and companies into Silicon Valley, where the best of the best just moved to Silicon Valley, which is, again, another reason why most places should not try to imitate Silicon Valley. However, when you talk about other stages of production, Silicon Valley have a lot less of a pulling power. When you talk about other industries that are not ICT, again, Silicon Valley is just not the same pull. With regards to platform, yes, it's a very interesting phenomena. Again, I think you see it from the technology side. You see it as you enjoy their power. I, as a political economist, view their power and how important and critical they become to human life. And I say, I smell regulation and antitrust in there. And the last thing you want to be is to be treated as a necessary utility on this world. And I think that's where the platform are running into without their funders and their backers understand. If they have becoming so crucial, let me tell you, it might take time, maybe even 20 years, but they will end up as heavily regulated as every other financial or physical utility on earth. Good luck to them.
Okay, I'm afraid you're right on that. Now, a question on social capital, and so in building and integrating in these models you described, to what extent can you use social capital to deal with economic inequality?
So first of all, let's simplify that concept of social capital so everybody can understand. So social capital, and there was another question from Zach about network, is the ability, if you will, to get things, that's why it's called capital, resources from social networks, either as an individual, a company, or a region. When we talk about regions with a lot of social capital, we also talk about regions with a lot of highly active, a large number of very highly active social network, which then can create what we call collective action. This is really important for a lot of regions, especially when you hit a crisis. But it also shows one other thing that policy needs to create, and that is those kind of very effective networks, if you will. People might call them social capital, but I call them effective networks. And that's what, in all those cases that I talk about in the book, really was part of the public policy. And with work with Stephen Sumford, who I hope is listening to us, one of my friends and co-authors, we talk about two ways in which you should think about it in terms of public policy. One is you don't have those networks and you need to build them from scratch, which is really what happened in Taiwan and in Israel. And the other, you have very strong networks, but you need to maybe recomposite them or give them different purpose in order to be successful. And that's the story of Finland, if you will, and what happened after the USSR went down and Finland was in a horrific economic crisis and needed to reinvent itself as a high-tech hub, which they did through those networks. And I highly recommend the book by my colleague, friend, and co-author Darius Ornstein on exactly that.
Now, here's a question on kind of the fragmented governance structure of American cities. And the question is, how can kind of American cities manage to come up with a good strategy given their fragmented governance structure?
So I think this is even a more general question, and that's exactly what this is a book about. I don't like too many social sciences papers and books because they sort of assume ideal type world where if you made the decision, you can put the ideal type best solution on earth just comes popping out. The reality is that all leaders and communities have severe limitations. And this book takes as granted that severe limitation, that you're a city. So you have a problem, you have several problems. You have and cities that are successful actually manage to do that. You need to create some kind of a collective action and get your act together. But also as a city, you have very limited ability to change regulation, to change legislation at the level of either the state, if we talk about the United States, or the federal level. So you need to game yourself within the system. And that's what's the book about. All the advice in the book does not assume that I can change regulation, does not assume that I can change modern finance. As a matter of fact, there's what I call the appendix, or the part 3 of the book, which talk about the dysfunctional IP system, the dysfunctional financial system, and the dysfunctional data system, and says, look, there is no way to change any of them. What you need to do is to understand how they work and game it so your community can actually achieve prosperity.
Give me an example. I mean, there's one chapter in data, which is very interesting, and data, of course, increasingly important. Let's not talk whether it's the new oil or something, but so how can a city come up with let's say, a data strategy or data plan? Or what does that actually mean?
First of all, in Toronto, it's a very painful question because you might have heard that Google at some point wanted to create a new smart part of a city, which all went downhill because of issues about data. So first of all, if you want a case study of how not to do it, go and look at the history of SciLab Toronto. If you want a case study of how to do it, it might not be a city in the precise sense of a word, but for us in America, the whole country is basically one city, and that's Estonia. And what you see in Estonia is they put down principles, very clear principles of who is allowed, how the data is collected, how the data is used, what is allowed and what not allowed, who has property rights on it. And you can do the same way in your cities. The way that I prefer to think about it is like regulation for manufacturing. The cities, and that's thanks to the much more smarter Professor Bresnitz. I know quite a bit about biotech. And what is interesting that in biotech manufacturing, especially in the beginning, cities that actually had very precise and tough regulation, but what you're allowed and not allowed to do when you manufacture biopharma are the cities that companies prefer to move to because the laws were clear and they knew when they will have a liability and when they won't have a liability. And what a city can do is create a framework of what data is collected, how you're allowed to use this data, who owns that data, how can you check that data, and it will become a place that companies that want to play in this world would come and play with.
Okay, great. Another question from the audience. So question of how to measure actually the success of innovation policy, not in terms of growth, but in terms of dealing with social inequality. So what would you say are the three main indicators that locales should look at in terms of what innovation policy does to alleviate social inequality?
So I don't know if innovation policy is the best way to alleviate social inequality. Let's be very clear about that. I love innovation, but I think that, and it's important, and the fact that we now have social innovation and inclusive innovation and innovation in whatever shows that people understand that. But whether innovation policy is the tool to solve all social problems, I want to be very clear about it, not. What I think that we can have is innovation policy that hopefully create less inequality or create more equality and prosperity, and preferably not create even more inequality. And with another friend and co-author of mine, I called it distribution sensitive innovation policies. And what I want to see in those places is actually key indicator of both. I want to see key indicator that innovation actually translate to economic growth. But then I want to see the number of jobs. I want to see also who is employed in those jobs. Are those only R&D white male engineers or everybody? I want to see the difference in wages. I want to see who has access to education. So both, and with another co-author and friend at the University of Toronto, Dan Monroe, we have tried to create exactly such a tool, which we call the Inclusive Innovation Monitor, okay? To monitor whether that is happening. But whether if I have unbelievable inequality, I should focus on innovation policy to solve it? No, I don't think so. But can I create with innovation policy an economic future for prosperity for that place? Definitely so.
Related question, I mean, from the audience, I mean, to what extent can you or should you incentivize then companies to, I mean, as they innovate or as part of innovation policy, that they should be kind of hire a diverse set of people, put some emphasis on social equality? I mean, is that part of the mix, or is that kind of what follows after the kind of the growth scenario you've created?
So I think let's just again be blunt, because, you know, as I said, I'm a political economist. What you should do is to ensure those companies locate all kind of activities and engage with all kind of activities and have the ability to do that. So access the right finance, speaking about the United States and production facilities, for example, where if you just can't get the capital to have those kinds of investment in your local. Because if you do that, those companies will create a diverse set of jobs to which they can recruit by definition a different kind of people. And then you can tell them, and by the way, in all those people that you recruit, I want to see a diversity. However, if you don't do that and you end up, and again, I'm sorry to harp on Silicon Valley, but just the clearest example, with companies that worth billions of dollars, but employ only 200 people, of them 180 are top R&D engineers, you can harp as much as you want about diversity. And you might see some diversity in terms of gender, of ethnicity. But the people with a very high skill will be employed, and the rest of your 85% of the population will live in a car and clean their houses for them, because those companies just don't create the jobs that employ those people. Pure and simple.
No, I mean, just in brackets, I mean, I have to defend Silicon Valley at least a bit here. That's my role. I mean, just looking at the platform operators and how many people they hire and what type of people they hire is probably looking a bit too narrowly. I mean, some of these platforms give employment to millions of people, and I think to some extent you should include those in the
Agreed.
I mean, those jobs may be not the right kind or kind of
yes
gig jobs,
but I will also say, if this book was not about local places, but the world, and it's actually, I say it in around page, I think, 5, humanity has never had it so good, thanks to innovation. We have put more people out of poverty, if you look globally, than any time in the past. If you forget COVID or see it as a blimp in time, because that's what it will be, again, thanks to innovation, life expectancy, quality, everything goes up. The problem with Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley, therefore, for the globe as a whole, is wonderful. It creates millions of wonderful jobs for people outside the United States. Let me be very clear about that. If I'm, however, the mayor of San Francisco, then I wonder whether all those tax incentives that they get from the US government and US taxpayers are really playing out well for San Francisco. Okay? So those kinds of companies and Silicon Valley companies create unbelievable prosperity around the globe. Do they create prosperity for people in Silicon Valley, California, and the United States? No longer, or at least not as much as they can do, partly not because of fault of them, but because of the way we decided to incentivize innovation. We decided how to regulate finance. We decided how to regulate IPR, we the people, because in America it's a democracy. And now we pay the price. The question is, can we change it and can we do something about it? And whether we want to.
No, since we've reached kind of the global level, two more global questions from me. And I mean, it's actually one. So you described this kind of increasingly fragmented global supply manufacturing networks or chains. Wonder what does the pandemic, or did the pandemic do to change that? That would be the first question. The second question is, so we're increasingly talking about a tech Cold War with China and decoupling or bifurcation of supply chains, all that. So how did or do both of these change your kind of how you see your mental image of global production networks?
So first of all, it's global production networks, because it's not just manufacturing, it's services as well. I don't know if you ever bought a Dell computer lately, but it's the product that you get and the service, which is why you buy a Dell, is produced all around the world, mainly not in the United States. I think that this is an unbelievably optimistic times, and I know I sound strange, optimistic times for cities and regions around the world, because finally the paradigm of this is how you should do things is evolving. The understanding that the fragmentation of production has happened and is going to stay is there, but a reorientation of how are we going to manage our global system is changing, which means that there's a lot of opening in all stages for places that want to excel. So if before, if you were not in Shenzhen, Dongguan, or China, there was no chance whatsoever that people might even look at you as a place where they will locate certain activities, this is now opening up. So places that can get their act together has better chances to excel in all those stages. That's one. The second, how I see global production networks, the way I envision them, and I hope I'm right, because if not, the next pandemic will force us to do that. And the next pandemic is just around the corner, or next political crisis, as you call. And that is much more robust global networks. Instead, we call it now global networks, but if we actually follow them, they move only through very, very specific places. And some of those stages are really concentrated, which means that if something hit that stage, that place, for example, the Greater China region, we will not have drugs, masks, ventilators. I mean, it just happened in the United States. So what I envision is that some of those global networks are then reimagined around the world. And you have, if you think about it in terms of investing, a little bit more hedging, or in terms of engineering, resiliency in our production networks. So still, let's say 85, or if China now produces 100 or 85% of certain kinds of, things on that stage, it will move to 85 or 60. But I do not see anytime soon the end of global production networks. I hope that we see some kind of reconfiguring in them that will actually help humanity as a whole to be more stable and sustained. And also, I think, allows a lot of promises for cities, what people like to call secondary regions in both the developed and the developing world, to get their act together and become an important node in those global production networks.
Now, you call yourself a hopeful cynic. I wonder, how far kind of do you think this reconfiguration of supply chains or kind of production networks will go? Because I remember, the whole thing, the discussion about bottlenecks and glue in Japan or chips in Taiwan. This is an old debate. And if you talk to companies, you see how difficult it is, for example, to Apple, to give an example, to pull manufacturing out of China and put it to India or Vietnam. It's really hard. And
yes.
So I wonder, yes, this has been discussed before. Not much has happened, and in 5 years we're back to the old very.
I can tell you, I can tell you even more horrific stories. I can tell you that now there are a lot of producers of N95 masks in the United States, but because the hospital procurement managers are now so stuck on and they have a whole system of getting those masks from China, they don't open them up even under COVID. So right now, the end of COVID or even middle of COVID, and my expectation will be that a lot of producers of N95 in the United States are going to go bankrupt. And that's where you need a political will to change it. And I'm very cynical. I think that unless we will continue to have more and more pain on those global production network, either through a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal, a nuclear accident and a tsunami in Japan, a never-ending pandemic, or a significant security threat, we will revert to the usual, because that's what humans do. Humans are like water. They look for the easiest way out of every painful situation. So it needs to be real, long, and sustained pain. That's one. And the second is there's need to be a long-term political will. But that still does not mean that there's not enough place, if you will, for opening, a political window of opening for places that are not China or Vietnam or Germany to start playing in those different stages. And now they have a chance that somebody will actually take them seriously and start to make them a nod in their supply networks.
Okay, last question about China and the tech Cold War bifurcation. I already mentioned that. I mean, do you think that that's a real threat or real kind of risk that it's happening? And again, what do you expect this to mean for global production networks?
I think that part of it is already happening. By the way, that's why another reason why I think that we have a chance to change the global supply network with, by the way, a price that humanity should not have paid. But I don't know if you noticed, the US can no longer compete in 5th generation mobile telephony. And I find it ironic that the hopes of a US security establishment is on 2 European companies, because they know that there's no American companies that can even play this game. So the price is going to be not catastrophic, but very high. As long as the politics stay as they are, I would assume that we'll have more and more bifurcation. My hope is that together with this bifurcation, because there's so much money to be had, and global human welfare will only increase if we keep the global system, but together with, you know, slight bifurcation on things at the top end, we will still have more or less the same global production networks for almost everything else, with a lot more resiliency. So it wouldn't be just China and just Chinese companies that can do stuff, or just American companies. It will be more, if you will, the world that Europe, Japan, and the US had after World War II, where the Japanese, the European, and the American all produced cars.
Well, thank you, Dan. That was great. I learned a lot, and I hope you're going to write another book, which I then can launch with you. And thanks for listening in. We had a big audience, more than 200 people, I think. Yeah, and I hope you'll be back then. Thanks a lot, and have a good day.
Thank you, Ludwig.
Bye.